statement I made, that little girl, if she came back there now for her clinical trial, likely she wouldn't be able to have any help, just as we learned earlier this week that there are 200 people who were turned away from clinical trials, 30 of which were babies and children.
Does the Senator agree to so modify his original request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I would note that the Majority Leader made a plea for compromise. And I think most Americans want to see a compromise. The House of Representatives has repeatedly compromised already. The House began, it is the view of every Republican in this body, and indeed every Republican in the House, that Obamacare should be entirely and completely repealed. Nonetheless, the House started with a compromise of saying not repealing Obamacare, but simply that it should be defunded. They funded the entire federal government and defunded Obamacare. It came to the Senate, and the Majority Leader and 54 Democrats voted in lockstep to say, no, absolutely not, we won't talk, we won't compromise. The House then came with a second compromise. They said, fine, if the Senate will not agree to fully defund Obamacare, then let's all agree to a reasonable one-year delay. President Obama has already delayed Obamacare for big business. Let's treat hardworking American families at least as well as big business. Let's have a one-year delay because we're seeing how badly this thing is working. Now, that's a big compromise from defunding. It came over to the Senate, and the Majority Leader and 54 Senate Democrats said, no, absolutely not. We will not talk. We will not compromise. Shut the government down. The House came back a third time and said, okay, how about we simply delay the individual mandate, one small portion of Obamacare, and we revoke the congressional exemption that President Obama illegally gave members of this Congress to exempt us from the burdens of Obamacare that are inflicted on millions of Americans. Now, Mr. President, that offer represented an enormous compromise from the view of Republicans that Obamacare should be repealed in its entirety. And what did the Senate say? Did the Senate say, let's sit down and work something out? Did the Senate say, let's find a middle ground? No. The Majority Leader and the 54 Senate Democrats said, absolutely not, no, we will not talk, we will not compromise, shut the government down. And that's why the government is shut down right now. Just a moment ago, the Majority Leader gave his latest offer. It was, give us everything we demanded, 100%, no compromise, no middle ground. That is the position of the Democrats in this body. Mr. President, that's not a reasonable position. That's not the way people work together to find a middle ground. You know, it was reported that the Majority Leader urged the President not even to talk to congressional leaders. Now, the President apparently had a change of heart and sat down with congressional leaders and had what, by all accounts, was an extraordinary conversation where President Obama told congressional leaders, I called you over here to say I'm not going to talk to you. I am not going to negotiate. I must admit, that's a remarkable conversation to call someone over to say, hi, good to see you, we're not going to talk. Mr. President, if this matter is going to be resolved, we need to see good faith among members on both sides. Republicans have repeatedly been offering compromises to resolve this shutdown, and unfortunately, the behavior of the majority party in this body has been my way or the highway, and one can only assume that their stated public belief, as what actually a senior administration official from the Obama administration said, we think we're winning politically. We don't, I'm paraphrasing, but we don't care when the shutdown ends. That's a paraphrase. It's not exact, but that was certainly the thrust of the statement from what was described as a senior administration official. I think that's cynical. I think that's partisan. I don't think that's what we should be doing. So I wish the Majority Leader and the Democrats would accede to what should be shared bipartisan priorities, but it appears right now that they are not, that their position is give us everything, fully fund Obamacare, and force it on the American people. That I cannot consent to, and so I object.
The objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, still reserving my right.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, my friend from Texas, and I have developed a relationship with him, talks about a meeting that he didn't attend, that the senator from Texas did not attend. I was there. I was one of 5 people. The President, Speaker Boehner, Leader McConnell, Leader Pelosi, and me. Oh, I do, yes, the Vice President was there also, I'm sorry. Now, Mr. President, I attended that meeting. The President didn't say, come on in, I'm not going to talk to you, I have nothing to say. Words to that effect. Meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. There was a lot of things said. But one thing that wasn't said is this Alice in Wonderland, what took place in that meeting, who talks about the meeting that wasn't there. So, Mr. President, let's talk about compromise. My friend brought up compromise. We have before us a continuing resolution. My friend, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, called me and said, we've got to work this out. We've got to get this done quickly. And I thought, so how are we going to get it done? This was on September 9th, after our recess ended. He said, we've got to have 788 number, the number for this year. 988, I'm sorry, thank you, 988. I said, I can't do that. I can't do that. Chairman Murray's number is $70 billion above that we passed here in the Senate. We passed it. I can't agree to 988. He said, you got to do it. I don't want a big fight. I want to get this done. So I talked to Chairman Murray, Chairman Mikulski, and others, and even though it was desperately hard to do, because we don't like the number of 988. We don't like it. It's not our number. We agreed to do it. That was a compromise. Mr. President, I've been in Congress 31 years, and that's the biggest compromise I've ever made. My caucus didn't like it, but we did it in an effort to have a clean CR. You talk about compromise, that was big time. But Speaker Boehner, I'm sure he was well-intentioned, he couldn't get it done. He couldn't get it done. It was his idea how to get it done. Then, Mr. President, talk about further compromise. One of the last things we had walked over from the House is go to conference. So I thought, I have something that he can't, it's an offer that's so good he couldn't refuse it. What did I do? With the cooperation of all 53 Democratic senators, here's what we agreed to do. Open the government, and what we will do is go to conference, not on little select areas. We'll go to conference on, I listed everything, not everything, but everything I could think of. We listed agriculture, we listed discretionary spending, and yes, we listed health care. But I gave the letter to the Speaker. I talked to him 45 minutes later, and he said, I can't do it. Wow. So, Mr. President, I know what legislation is all about. It is the art of compromise. I understand that. And we have compromised in big-time fashion. The problem is the Speaker and some other Republican members of Congress are in a real bind because the only thing they want to talk about is a law that passed 4 years ago, the Supreme Court declared constitutional, which is a little unusual, I would think, my experience here. So we, Mr. President, are where we are because we not only have the government shut down, but we have the full faith and credit of our nation before us in a week or 10 days. So, Mr. President, I suggest I don't want anyone to say that I haven't compromised. All one needs to do is talk to any member of my caucus, and they will talk about how difficult it has been for us to accept that number and agree to go to conference on anything. So I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
friend would yield. Following his...
Majority Leader.
Yes, thank you. Following his statement of 20 minutes, I ask that the following senators be recognized. Here we go. Mikulski already has 15 minutes. Murray, I ask consent that she follow Mikulski for 10 minutes. Heinrich, for how much time? 10 minutes. Schumer, 15 minutes. So if I ask consent, that be the case.
Is there objection? Are those the next senators in order or on the Democratic side?
Well, Mr. President, if some Republicans want to come and talk, my friends, I'd be happy to yield to any of them, but we haven't had a large number of people over here this morning.
Without objection. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, you know, Bismarck famously talked about legislation being like making sausages, and there are aspects of both that are not pretty. I wish we saw elected leaders in both parties working together to listen to the American people. You know, the majority leader talked about the meeting at the White House, and I will note, he noted that I was not at that meeting. That is certainly true. But the statement that the President said he would not negotiate came directly from Speaker Boehner, who was at that meeting, who came and gave a press conference immediately thereafter. And I know the majority leader is not impugning the integrity of the Speaker of the House or disputing that that is exactly what President Obama said and what the position of the Democrats has said. Their position is, give us 100% of what we want or the government stays shut down. And, Mr. President, that quite simply is not reasonable. Now, I'd like to address for a moment a few of the arguments that have been raised against these very reasonable bipartisan proposals to fund essential priorities in our government, because I think the arguments don't withstand scrutiny. There are some on the Democratic side of the aisle that have said, we're not going to pick and choose. Indeed, the majority leader said there's no reason to have to choose between government priorities. Mr. President, let me suggest that's the essence of legislation. We have a $17 trillion debt because far too many people have said, as the majority leader just did, there's no reason to choose between priorities. We should spend on everything. And I would note also that what the Democrats in this chamber deride as a piecemeal strategy is the traditional means of appropriating and legislating. The only reason that we have this omnibus continuing resolution is because Congress has failed to do its job to appropriate on specific subject matters. So we should be considering the VA on its own merits. And I would note, the majority leader is right that the House bill funded the most critical components of the VA, pension and home loan and GI Bill and disability payments. But I would readily accede to the majority leader that if he would like a continuing resolution that funds the entirety of the VA, including the elements he laid out, I think we could reach unanimous agreement on that within hours. The traditional means of legislating is one subject at a time. It is not typical when considering funding for the VA that the argument be about unrelated matters, whether it is the Department of Agriculture or Obamacare. The way this body has always operated is it's considered one subject matter at a time, except when Congress has failed to appropriate and then everything has gotten lumped together in a giant omnibus bill. But there's no reason for that. But secondly, Mr. President, every bit as critically, we've done it already. This is not theoretical. At the beginning of this proceeding, the House of Representatives unanimously passed a bill saying, let's fund the men and women of our military. Now, when it came over to the Senate, a great many people expected the majority leader to do what the majority leader just did, to object to funding the men and women of our military. And indeed, some 20 Republican senators came down to the floor prepared to make the argument that we shouldn't hold the men and women of the military hostage. And yet, much to our very pleasant surprise, the majority leader reconsidered. He decided that it was, one must assume, not defensible to hold hostage the paychecks of the men and women of the military. And so the majority leader agreed, and this body unanimously passed funding for the men and women of the military. Said, look, regardless of what happens with a government shutdown, our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines should not be held hostage. They should get their paychecks. And indeed, I rose on the Senate floor. I commended the majority leader for doing the right thing, for acting in a bipartisan manner. And yet, sadly, that was the last of that behavior we were to see. I hope that majority leader returns. I hope the majority leader who said, we're going to fund the men and women of our military, returns to say the same thing to our veterans. I hope that majority leader returns to say the same things to our National Guard. I hope that majority leader returns to say the same thing to our parks and war memorials. I hope that majority leader returns to say the same thing to the National Institutes for Health, to say the same thing to children facing life-threatening diseases like cancer. You know, we may not be able to resolve 100% of this impasse today. There are differences, and to resolve those differences is going to take sitting down, talking, working through the matters of disagreement. One side of this chamber is prepared to do this, the Democrats are not. In the meantime, it ought to be a bipartisan priority to fund our veterans. You know, a second possible objection, I can see some watching this debate who think, well, okay, but if you fund the VA, doesn't that mean the Democrats have given in on Obamacare? Somehow it's got to be connected to Obamacare, right? Mr. President, as every member of this body knows, the VA is totally disconnected. The VA bill that passed the House, it doesn't implicate Obamacare, it doesn't mention Obamacare, it does nothing on Obamacare. Look, we've got a disagreement on Obamacare. Part of this body thinks it's a terrific bill. Part of this body thinks it's a train wreck, a disaster that's hurting millions of Americans. That's an important debate. But whether or not our veterans get their disability payment shouldn't be made hostage to resolving that debate. It is exactly like the bill that my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle already voted for to fund the men and women of the military. It's exactly the same. They've done it once, and yet for whatever reason, they have made a decision that certainly appears to the public to be cynical and partisan. There should be no confusion. The House of Representatives has overwhelmingly voted to protect our veterans and fund the VA. 35 Democrats joined Republicans in the House to do that. 35. It was bipartisan legislation. It came over here. Every Senate Republican agrees we should fund the VA. We should pass this bill. There is unanimity. And indeed, the President, when he addressed the nation, said his priority was to fund the VA. So we've got Republicans and Democrats in the House agreeing we should fund the VA. We have Republicans in the Senate and a Democratic President of the United States agreeing we should fund the VA. And sadly, we have Democrats in the Senate and a majority leader in the Senate objecting and stopping the VA from being funded. If my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle simply stood up right now and withdrew their objection, by the end of the day, the VA would receive its funding. If my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle simply stood up and withdrew their objection, by the end of the day, our friends in the reserve would receive their paychecks or would have the paychecks and the funding returned. If my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle withdrew their objection, by the end of the day, our national parks and memorial would have their funding and we'd be able to open the Statue of Liberty, open our war memorials. And by the end of the day, we could restore the funding to the National Institutes of Health. And let me note, there are many other priorities. My friend from Maryland, when he was talking about other priorities, look, there are a great many aspects of government. For example, earlier this week, the Director of National Intelligence and the head of the NSA testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the head of National Intelligence said that some 70% of civilian employees in the intelligence community have been furloughed and that presents a real threat to our national security. Mr. President, if that's right, where is the Commander-in-Chief? Why is the President of the United States not down here right now saying, look, regardless of what y'all do in the rest of the budget, don't expose us to national security threats. Let's fully fund the Department of Defense. Let's fully fund our intelligence agencies. And indeed, I would note that one senator, the junior senator from Arizona, asked the head of national intelligence, have you advised the president that Congress should pass a continuing resolution funding the intelligence community just like we did for the members of the armed forces? And the answer from the head of the national intelligence, appointed by President Obama, was, yes, Congress should do it, and yes, I will advise the president. Mr. President, right now we have Senate Democrats who are not listening to the testimony and advice of the members of our intelligence community who say that there is a grave national security threat that we are not adequately prepared to defend ourselves against. Surely partisan politics should end at that point. Surely we should be able to come together and say, look, we can keep fighting on Obamacare. We may have disagreements, and eventually we'll work it out. But surely we shouldn't expose our national security to threats from terrorists or attacks on our homeland in the meantime. That ought to be 100 to 0, Mr. President. But at the end of the day, there's only one explanation that makes sense for why you saw one Democrat after another standing up and objecting, no, don't fund the VA, no, don't fund the reserve members of our military, no, don't fund the parks, no, don't fund the memorials, no, don't fund the National Institutes of Health. The only explanation which is at all plausible is that many members of this body agree with some of the pundits that this shutdown benefits the political fortunes of Democrats. You know, I sure hope people are focused on things other than political fortunes and partisan politics, because I know every one of us takes seriously the obligation we have to our constituents back home. I sure hope that's not going on, but, you know, it's hard for the American people not to be cynical when they read about Mount Vernon, which is privately owned and operated, doesn't get its money from the federal government, being effectively forced to shut down because the federal government blocked the parking lots and put up barricades to prevent people from going to Mount Vernon. It's hard not to be cynical when you read about what my friend Senator John Thune told me about Mount Rushmore, that the federal government erected barricades on the roads leaving Mount Rushmore. Spent the money to do it, mind you. There's a shutdown. They spent the money to erect the barricades. Problem is, those aren't federal roads. Those are state roads, and the governor said, take them down. The only conclusion that's possible there is that you're seeing cynical partisan gamesmanship, a decision by President Obama and, unfortunately, by Democrats in this body, that inflicting the maximum pain on the American people will yield political benefits. We ought to be able to agree our veterans are above politics. We ought to be able to agree our war memorials are above politics. We ought to be able to come together and agree that defending national security, defending against terrorist threats is above politics. And everyone in Congress is prepared to do so, except for the majority leader and the Senate Democrats who are insisting everything be shut down. So, Mr. President, if a federal government worker is at home today furloughed, you should know the reason is, in large part, because the Senate Democrats refuse to let you come back to work. Because we could agree for significant portions of the federal government to come back to work Monday morning if simply the Democrats would stop objecting, stop insisting that they get everything on Obamacare. And let me note, the issue on Obamacare is very simple. Is there a double standard? President Obama has exempted big business and exempted members of Congress. And yet he has forced a government shutdown to deny that same exemption to hardworking Americans. Millions of Americans who are losing their jobs, being forced into part-time work, facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums, and losing their health insurance. Let me remind this body of the words of James Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, who said that Obamacare is destroying the health care, and he used the word destroying the health care of millions of working men and women in this country. If you don't believe me, perhaps James Hoffa, who put it in writing that it is right now destroying the health care of millions of working men and women, will underscore what this fight is about. All the seniors, all the people with disabilities, all the people who are right now getting notices that they're losing their health insurance, that's what this fight is about. And at a minimum, we ought to agree on common priorities. We ought to come together today, right now, and fund the VA. We ought to come together today, right now, and fund our reservists and the National Guard. We ought to come together today, right now, and fund our national parks, open our memorials, stop barricading and sending police officers to prevent World War II veterans from coming to the World War II Memorial. And we ought to come together right now to fund the National Institutes of Health, because everyone agrees on that. And the decision to hold those priorities hostage because the Democrats want to force Obamacare on everyone, it's not related to them. It has nothing to do with them. It's all about political leverage. And, Mr. President, that's not the way we should be doing our jobs. We should be listening to the people. We should make D.C. listen. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Levin be the next Democratic speaker following Senator Schumer's remarks.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before I go into my comments, I want to express my thanks to the Capitol Police, to the Secret Service, and all who responded to yesterday's pretty scary and dramatic incident. I also want to express my hope that the injured Capitol Police officer quickly and fully recovers. And to the little girl that's now been left without her mother, I just hope that all of this great tragedy that unfolds, we give the support to the people who really have suffered from this. Mr. President, my colleague from Texas has laid out a vision of how he would like to see the day end. He would like to see the day end funding VA, NIH, open the Park Service, and I think there was one more item, but I'll stick with those three: NIH, FDA, and VA. He would like to see at the end of the day they be open for business. Mr. President, I have a different vision for the end of the day. At the end of the day today, I would like to see the House of Representatives take up and vote on the Senate-passed continuing funding resolution that would reopen the entire federal government. Keep it open, not for a long term, because we have fiscal issues through November 15th at fiscal 13 levels. At the end of the day, if they took up the Senate-passed resolution and actually voted on it, at the end of the day, the federal government would be open. At the end of the day, people would actually be back on the job, getting paid for the job that they signed up to do, and we would have the United States of America's government working the way it should. At the end of the day, it means that the Capitol Hill police officers that were at their duty stations would get their pay. Now they're working without pay. Under my vision of America, if we open up the entire United States government, it means FBI agents that are currently working, doing their job, protecting America. At the end of the day, they would be paid. Right now, FBI agents and other federal law enforcement are working for IOUs. The very FBI agents that we count on are using their own money to put gas in the cars that they need to go after the bad guys or the bad guys. So under the Mikulski recommendation that was passed by the Senate, at the end of the day, FBI agents would be paid and they wouldn't have to use their own money to put gas in the cars. That's what my vision of the end of the day is. We cannot continue to fund government. We have to reopen government. Their strategy, their cynical strategy, given with ruffles and flourishes and pomp, self-righteous, standing up for our veterans, opening up our national parks, funding NIH, really is hollow. Let's take FBI. Let's take the veterans. In order to, and it would be great if they actually understood how government works. So let's take the VA disability claim. In order to get your disability benefits, your eligibility is determined not only by the VA, but information you get from the civilian workforce at DOD, from the Social Security Administration, headquartered in Woodlawn, Maryland, where 9,000 federal employees are furloughed, or you would get it from the Internal Revenue Service, also headquartered in Maryland, where 5,000 federal employees are furloughed. So if we reopened all of the government, at the end of the day, yes, veterans would get their benefits, but they'll get them because not only VA is open, but so is Social Security. So are the civilian workforce at DOD. So are the people who work at the Internal Revenue Service, making sure all the paperwork is done in the way that it should. That is what the end of the day should look like. My colleague talks from Texas about how he would like to reopen NIH. Oh, boy, so would I. 71% of the people at NIH right this minute are furloughed. He wants to, at the end of the day, open NIH. So do I. But I also know that after you do your research and you've engaged in that, and our private sector comes in and begins to develop the products that they need to take those great ideas into the new products that will save lives and create jobs in the United States of America, those private sector people need to go to the FDA and the Food and Drug Administration. So at the end of the day, if you want to help NIH stay open to find the cures for diseases that we want them to do, we also want the private sector inventing the products that will take those great ideas and turn them into the very things that can save lives here and be able to be sold around the world because they've been certified as safe and effective. So at the end of the day, I would like to open the FDA. But I don't want to do it one agency at a time. I want to reopen the entire federal government. It just seems that whatever we now shame them into talking about, they then decide that agency is important and the House passes the bill. I don't want shame. I don't want blame. And I don't want political games. I want the government of the United States of America to be opened. Now, let's go to another agency. They haven't even talked about other agencies. Let's take the Weather Service. Right now, Mr. President, storm clouds are gathering, not only here in Washington over politics, but they're gathering in the Southwest. A hurricane is on its way. Now, the Weather Service is also in Maryland. 800 people are supposed to be on their job. I was there during another hurricane just a few months ago. Last October, I was there while they were at their duty station for Hurricane Sandy. We watched this hurricane come. It was devastating. We all recall how devastating it was. In my own state, my mountain counties were hit by a blizzard. Down over on the eastern shore, they were hit by the hurricane, wiping out whole communities and neighborhoods, some owning family homes and farms that go back generations. Now, those very weather service people are furloughed. They're absolutely furloughed. Now, the Weather Service is calling them back, but they're going to be without pay. Let me put a human face on who I'm talking about. Yesterday I spoke to Amy Fritz. She works at the Weather Service. She has 2 master's degrees, one in meteorology and the other as a physical oceanographer. Her job is to predict storm surges coming from the hurricane, how her work protects walls of water, knowing where that's going to happen, what's going to happen, and how we can begin to protect ourselves so that while we try to save property, we can definitely provide lives. Amy is the primary breadwinner in her family. She is now not getting paid. She has $130,000 in student loans so she could get that great education. And she wanted that great education because she thought, I can serve America. I can be a good scientist and a great American. Well, at the end of the day, I want the Weather Service open. At the end of the day, I want Amy getting paid. At the end of the day, I want the entire federal government open, not on what just emerges as they've decided as a pet. Every part of the federal government somewhere is playing an essential part to the lives of this country and to the communities in which they serve. Last night, there was something called the Sammy Awards. These are awards given to federal employees because of outstanding service. They've either saved lives or they've saved money. Well, let me tell you, there was one federal employee at the National Institutes of Standards. He has a new way of being able to protect us against fires. Another federal employee who's also been furloughed has come up with how to save $1 billion, employee after employee. So I say to all the federal employees who might be watching, at the end of the day, I think you're important. At the end of the day, whatever job you do, I want you to do it well. I want you to strive for competence and excellence, but I want to do my job well. I extend my hand on the other side of the aisle, as I've done repeatedly during the year that I have chaired this Committee on Appropriations. I have negotiated, I have compromised, and I will continue to do the same, because at the end of the day, I want the federal government open, doing the job that those people were trained to do, that we hired them to do. I want the federal employees to be able to be on there doing the duty that they signed up. Every job has an important mission. Whether you're a meat inspector, a poultry inspector, whether you're at the Weather Service. So we could continue to do this where they send over a program at a time. My gosh. Once again, we're wasting time. And where is our standing in the world? At the end of the day, I want us to be respected. I want us to be respected. What do they think about us around the world? I've been to hearing after hearing where there's a lot of hand-wringing and chest-pounding over what we need to do about China. China isn't doing this to us. We're doing it to ourselves. There's no foreign predator attacking our federal government. We're just defunding it. That's what a shutdown is. You're not funding the federal government. This is not the way the United States of America should be. I know the calls that I'm getting from the over 100,000 federal employees that I have. They want to be on the job. It's not only that they want to get paid, they actually want to work. And, you know, they're prohibited from taking anything home where they could be working. This is just terrible. So at the end of the day, let's find a new way. At the end of the day, let's find a new way to keep the government open. At the end of the day, let's be proud of ourselves and let the federal government be reopened. I once again conclude my remarks by saying to the House of Representatives, please take up the Senate continuing funding resolution that would reopen the federal government right away and get us at the desk so that we could negotiate further fiscal compromises. That's the way I would like to see the day end. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Maryland for her very, very self-emotional response and her great statement. And I hope that all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the houses listen to what she just said to us. She represents a state that's probably impacted as much, if not more, than any other state because of the number of federal employees who work at FDA and NIH and throughout our federal government agencies. She did not come out here on the floor and say, open up all of the jobs in my state and make sure my state is taken care of. She came out here and said, open up the federal government so every American, every state, every part of our country is taken care of. And she's right. I share her vision for the end of the day. Not that we take a few here and a few there and what I decide is important here today, but our country gets back to work. And I really share her vision that Speaker Boehner simply takes up the bill that's at his desk, allow it to pass. It has the votes. And at the end of this day, we can be proud that our country is back at work. So I thank the senator from Maryland for her very, very well-stated remarks. And, Mr. President, I just wanted to speak today about what's going on. You know, Representative Marlin Stutzman said something that I think sums up the House Republican position perfectly. He said yesterday, and I quote, "We're not going to be disrespected. We have to get something out of this, and I don't even know what that, and I don't know what that even is." We have to get something out of this, the Republicans in the House. I think that statement makes it very clear. First of all, House Republicans have exactly one set of interests in their mind, their own. And secondly, they couldn't be more removed from the impacts of the shutdown that are being felt across the country. Mr. President, every day that Speaker Boehner refuses to reopen the government is another day of inconvenience and stress and uncertainty for families and communities that we all serve. And because House Republicans clearly aren't getting the message yet, today I want to describe some of what my constituents in Washington State, over 2,000 miles away from here, are saying about the effects of the shutdown. The families I talk to in Washington State aren't interested in the partisan political strategizing that goes on here in Washington, D.C. They have a lot more important issues on their mind right now. Every day they are reading about how the government shutdown is affecting their community. Many are feeling the impacts themselves. Mr. President, there are about 50,000 federal employees in Washington State. Thousands are being sent home without pay. The shutdown is going to put a serious burden on many of these workers' families, but the consequences reach even further. This week, the Seattle Times spoke to a deli owner whose shop happens to be in downtown Seattle. She gets about 30% of her sales from federal workers in the building that is across the street from her. Without their business now, they're all home, and without knowing how long this shutdown is going to last, she is concerned about how she's going to pay her rent and pay her employees. She said, and I quote, "I don't think Congress is thinking of people like us." Well, it's hard to disagree with that, Mr. President. The shutdown is affecting so many. In fact, it's affecting other crucial parts of my home state of Washington. Our national parks are closed. Campers and hikers have been asked to leave. And if the government doesn't open soon, participants in the Bering Sea king crab fishery, which my colleague from Alaska spoke about earlier this morning when I was on the floor, many of them are based actually in Washington State. They're going to face significant economic losses. Why? Because NOAA employees are needed to process and issue their quotas. They've all been furloughed. There's no one at work to do the work they need to do their job. Now, I spoke with some of my constituents in the Washington State construction industry. They told me their business is slow because of all the uncertainty about where our economy is going to be because of the shutdown and because of the looming debt ceiling deadline. And there's so much more. While our active duty military will continue to be paid, some of those who have heroically served our country are being affected. Furloughs in Washington State and across this country have forced our veterans to stay home and lose pay. And as the shutdown continues, veterans are watching and they're waiting. Because if this government doesn't open soon, VA benefits, which many of our veterans rely on just to make ends meet, and support from the GI Bill is going to stop. Now, Mr. President, our veterans should not, under any circumstances, be burdened by partisan games. But unfortunately, the longer this shutdown goes on, the more they are having to sacrifice. And this shutdown is affecting the dedicated civilian employees who support our military. We have as many as 8,000 civilian employees at Joint Base Lewis McChord who've been impacted. Some are going to work without pay, and some have been sent home without pay and without any sense or idea of when they're going to be able to return. And by the way, Mr. President, many of those workers are veterans. And many have already been victims of the gridlock and brinksmanship here in our nation's capital. A Washington State news station spoke with Joint Base Lewis McChord employee Matthew Hines just earlier this week, and he said his family already lost $1,300 because of the sequestration furloughs this summer. They are struggling to pay their bills and had to refinance their mortgage. This week, Matthew and his family were left wondering whether they would face more lost pay, more uncertainty. Mr. President, the shutdown is creating uncertainty for struggling families as well who depend on our nutrition assistance programs. The spokesman review in Spokane, Washington, talked with a woman named Rosa Shavira. She's the mother of an 11-month-old girl. Now, Rosa gets support, because she needs it right now, from the Women, Infants, and Children WIC program. Helps her put food on the table. Now, we're hearing that the Washington State Department of Health is estimating that WIC funds would be threatened as early as next month if this continues. So next month, if we're still in a shutdown just a few weeks away, Rosa might take her vouchers to the grocery store and just be unable to buy any food for her family. Rosa told the spokesman review that is a scary situation. Now, what I just talked about are just a few of the examples that we're seeing in my home state of Washington. But I know families and communities across this country could tell a lot of similar stories. Mr. President, this is beyond frustrating for me. It's beyond frustrating for my fellow Democrats and many Republicans, including, by the way, at least 20 in the House of Representatives so far, who see absolutely no reason why this shutdown has to continue. We may not agree on much, Mr. President, but there does seem to be bipartisan agreement this shutdown has to end. And once it does, we should begin the negotiations that many of us, including myself, have been on the floor calling for since March, to work towards a bipartisan agreement that ends the brinksmanship, ends the manufactured crisis that are so harmful to our workers and our economy. I know Speaker Boehner and the Tea Party aren't on the same page as the rest of us about that yet. But as we continue to hear from thousands of Americans, from fishermen to small business owners to struggling moms who are being hurt as this shutdown occurs, I hope they will at least stop standing in the way of those of us who are ready to get to work. So, Mr. President, I want to close by quoting Kirsten Watts from Tacoma, Washington. She works for the Bonneville Power Administration in Seattle, and she told the Seattle Times, and I quote, "It's just sad that the government is playing games with people's livelihoods." Now, Kirsten said that workers at her agency would still be coming in, but she's worried about the others who won't be. She was thinking about how this shutdown will impact others. And I think Speaker Boehner and the Tea Party, who according to Representative Stutzman are laser focused on what's in it for them, could learn a lot from that approach. So I say today to Speaker Boehner, open up the government. Let everybody go back to work. Stop hurting our economy. And Mr. President, all that requires is bringing the Senate-passed continuing resolution up for a vote on the House floor so that Democrats and Republicans who want the government to reopen can pass it. And once the government is open, we would be more than happy to sit down and work out our longer-term budget agreement. But we're not going to do it with our families and our workers and our small businesses being held hostage. This is not the time to talk about opening the government. It's time to actually do it. The entire country is watching and wondering how we got to this point. Let's do the right thing and show them we can work together and fulfill the basic responsibilities we were elected to do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Like many other members who've spoken on the floor today, I too want to just acknowledge the extraordinary work that's done by the Capitol Police officers. Every single day they work around here protecting the people who work here, the people who visit here. And yesterday was another great example of just the skill, the professionalism, the courage that they display on a daily basis in a very quiet and humble way. And I just want to express on my own behalf and the people that I represent our appreciation for their extraordinary work and the remarkable way in which they go about their jobs, and just how very grateful we all are for that. Mr. President, I wanted to talk today about what's happening here in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in the fourth day of what is a completely avoidable partial government shutdown. Now, it's not like we didn't see this coming. The fiscal year ends every year on September 30th. So it wasn't a deadline that we didn't know was coming. In fact, as I pointed out before, the House of Representatives completed work on 4 appropriation bills. Unfortunately, here in the Senate, we didn't move appropriation bills across the floor to comply with the Budget Control Act. We didn't pass a single one this fiscal year. And then recognizing the need to act at the end of the fiscal year as it approached, the House passed and sent to the Senate a continuing resolution on September 20th, 2 weeks ago. Instead of acting quickly to bring us to a resolution to keep the government funded, Senate leadership continued to stall, unwilling to negotiate. Mr. President, the House has now sent us 4 comprehensive proposals to fund the government and to provide fairness under the law when it comes to Obamacare. One of these proposals included a request for a conference committee so we could get to work resolving our differences. Very straightforward request. The other proposals that had been sent over here, which had other elements in them dealing with Obamacare as well as government funding, were rejected by the Senate. They were tabled here. And so this was a proposal that was very simple and straightforward. All it asked was, let's have a conference. Let's sit down and try and work out our differences. Unfortunately, the Democrat majority here in the United States Senate insisted that they will not negotiate. They tabled the motion, the request to go to conference with the House of Representatives. So far this week, the House of Representatives has sent us 5 bills to fund various parts of our government. And I understand they're continuing to work on additional bills today. These are bills that would ensure that our veterans get paid, that children can continue to have access to life-saving treatments. Yesterday morning, my Republican colleagues and I came to the floor and requested that several of these common sense bills that the House has sent to us be agreed to by unanimous consent here in the Senate. Specifically, I asked for a unanimous consent agreement for the Pay Our Guard and Reserve Act. This bill would ensure that the men and women who proudly serve in our National Guard and Reserves, those who have bravely answered the call to protect and defend our country, continue to train and to get paid for their service. Congress should send a clear message to these men and women who stand ready to serve in overseas conflicts or to respond to domestic disasters that they will not be impacted by the spending disagreements here in Washington. Unfortunately, our friends on the other side of the aisle objected to these requests. And unbelievably, Mr. President, the President of the United States has actually threatened to veto those very measures. Congress has already passed by unanimous consent a bill to ensure that active duty military personnel are paid during this lapse in government funding. And it's unclear to me as to why Senate Democrats wouldn't pass similar measures to fund these important services. After all, taking care of active duty military personnel was something that everybody agreed here. Unanimous consent. That rarely happens around here in the United States Senate. But Democrats and Republicans agreed this is a priority. We need to make sure the men and women, the active duty men and women in our military who defend this country on a daily basis get paid despite the dysfunction here in Washington, D.C. Well, all this, the bill that I offered yesterday simply would have done is applied that same treatment to our Guard and Reserve. In my state of South Dakota, we have about 4,300 members of the Army and Air National Guard, a couple hundred of which are deployed right now. The remainder obviously have training functions that they perform on a regular basis. If we don't get this issue resolved, they're not going to be able to meet those training requirements. And of course, as we all know, they respond to domestic disasters, to emergencies that require their assistance here. at home, as well as on a regular basis now being deployed to meet the military requirements that we have in many of the conflicts that we're involved in around the world. And so it strikes me as very strange, Mr. President, that Democrats would refuse to act or engage in a meaningful debate in order to find common ground on issues like this and to get our government back up and running. Now, I think that the people I represent in the state of South Dakota, like a lot of other people across the country, expect their leaders to work together to resolve their differences. The position of the Democrat leadership is that they will not negotiate, to simply work together. That's not a position that I believe is reasonable. We've heard that from the President. We've heard it from the leaders here, the Democrat leaders here in the Senate. We're not going to negotiate. Well, I think most Americans believe that they send us here to Washington, D.C. to work together, realizing there are differences, legitimate differences about how to solve problems and how to approach issues. But they believe on a very basic level that the responsibility that we have as their elected officials is to sit down and try and figure out how to solve these problems. And so to say that we will not negotiate as a starting position is a completely unreasonable position to take in the eyes, I believe, of the American people. The dysfunction, the gridlock that we have here in Washington, D.C., Mr. President, is simply unacceptable. On Wednesday, the President invited congressional leaders to the White House for what unfortunately turned out to be yet just sort of another photo opportunity, publicity stunt. The President waited until after the 11th hour, I should say, 2 days into a partial government shutdown, to even engage in a face-to-face way with congressional leaders. It strikes me that when you invite people to the table in the same breath, make explicit that you're not willing to negotiate, that very little work is going to get done for the American people. I would hope that we would see better from our President, better from our leaders here in the United States Senate. It seems like, at least, Mr. President, that Democrats are very content to take their ball and to go home. 4 days into a partial government shutdown, and they still refuse to negotiate. We haven't experienced a government shutdown now for nearly 20 years, and so I would pose to my friends on the other side of the aisle that the willingness of leaders in both parties to negotiate in good faith during previous negotiations is something we could take a lesson from. If you go back to 1995 and 1996, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, when he was talking about the shutdowns in that period, said that Bill Clinton, President Clinton, and I would talk. If not every day, we would talk 5 days a week before the shutdown, after the shutdowns. We met face to face for 35 days in the White House trying to hammer things out. Mr. President, as you know, ending this unnecessary shutdown is not the only challenge we're dealing with here in Washington. But when it comes to the debt ceiling, which the Treasury tells us will be reached in the next few weeks, again, Democrats refuse to come to the table to enact responsible spending reforms as part of that package. Well, the American people disagree. According to a recent Bloomberg poll, Americans by a 2-to-1 margin disagree with President Barack Obama's contention that Congress should raise the U.S. debt limit without conditions. Mr. President, the American people understand that we continue to borrow and borrow and borrow like there's no tomorrow and pile that burden on the back of our children and grandchildren. And they understand that if you're going to increase the debt limit, if you're going to ask for a bigger credit card limit, that you ought to be doing something about the debt. And that's why by a 2-to-1 margin they believe that if you're going to raise the debt limit, you ought to do something to address the underlying debt. In fact, 61% of Americans, according to that poll, believe it's right to require spending cuts when the debt ceiling is raised, even if it risks default. Now, I don't believe we ought to have a default, Mr. President, but I do believe that a negotiation on the debt limit makes sense if you're serious about doing something about the debt. And every time in the past when we've had major budget deals, whether you go back to the Gramm-Rudman deal in 1985 or the 1990 budget agreement or the 93 budget agreement or the 1997 budget agreement or the one more recently now in 2011, the Budget Control Act, it was always done around in association with an increase in the debt limit. There is clear precedent, clear history when we're facing an increase in the debt limit, to have a serious, substantive debate in this country about how to address the debt. In many cases, those led to some of the few times in our nation's history where we've actually gotten budget agreements that did something to reduce spending. It might come as a surprise to some of my colleagues here that inasmuch as many of us don't like the sequester that came out of the Budget Control Act of 2011, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for an additional minute.
Without objection.
Mr. President, what came out of that was now for the first time since the 1950s, literally since the Korean War, government spending has gone down for 2 consecutive years. It can be done. It can be done when reasonable people are willing to sit down and negotiate. But that requires the engagement of the Chief Executive of the President of the United States. It requires the goodwill of people here in the United States Senate. It doesn't entail taking a position that we will not negotiate. That's not a position, Mr. President. What we need is an opportunity where we can sit down together and focus on these big challenges that we have. In the meantime, we continue to have opportunities to vote to fund veterans programs, to vote to fund our National Guard and Reserve, to fund the National Institutes of Health, those important priorities that many of my colleagues on the Democrat side have gotten up and talked about. We have bills coming over from the House of Representatives. We could do like we did with the Military Pay Act, pick them up and pass them by unanimous consent so we don't have to worry about any of these issues not being addressed and the important programs and projects not being funded. That's all it simply takes, Mr. President. I hope that can happen. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.